So what do Taylor Swift and Rihanna have in common? Well, besides being phenomenally talented, beautiful, and making amazing music, it's their bend towards female empowerment. But there's a conflict between their different ways of showing support for women. And that's exactly what this poem is getting at. It's analyzing that underlying conflict between Black feminists and the mainstream feminist movement. So in this poetry analysis, I'm going to read the poem and then I'll look at the historical context for the poem. Then we'll do an analysis, and at the end, I'll make connections between the poem and myself and also the poem and the world at large. And please, at any point in this video, if you feel inspired or motivated, please leave a comment below because I absolutely love to see those kinds of connections. I mean, that's like my lifeblood, why I'm making this video. Who Said It Was Simple by Audre Lorde. There are so many roots to the tree of anger that sometimes the branches shatter before they bear. Sitting in Netics, the women rally before they march, discussing the problematic girls they hire to make them free. An almost white counterman passes, a waiting brother to serve them first. And the ladies neither notice nor reject the slighter pleasures of their slavery. But I, who am bound by my mirror as well as my bed, see causes in color as well as sex, and sit here wondering which me will survive all these liberations. The first thing that you notice about that poem is that it doesn't rhyme. Most poems rhyme, but this poem is in free verse, and writing in free verse gives a poet more flexibility in terms of combining words and ideas, right? Now, this poem was written, it was published in 1973 by Audre Lorde. Audre Lorde was born in 1934 in New York City. So she was born at a time when segregation existed. So she lived in a segregated, separate world from white people as a Black woman in New York City, or as a Black girl in New York City. Even though it was far away from the Jim Crow South, there was still segregation and there was still an expectation that Black people would sit at the back of the bus or give up their seats for other people. This poem was published in 1973, which is well after the Civil Rights Movement, but it was still written and possibly inspired by some of the more problematic things that were happening in the 60s and also into the 70s, right? So you see that second wave of feminism, which started around the 1960s and it ran into the 1980s. That second wave of feminism started because, there's World War II and all of the women who were going out and working and really building this women's world and life while all of the men were fighting in the war and not there. Suddenly the men come back and they want their jobs back. They expect that their wives are going to return to being domestic. And there's this backlash from women because women wanted to keep some of that power. So you see in the 1960s, not just the liberation movements in terms of civil rights movements, but also the liberation movements for women in terms of women's empowerment, women's ability to go out to work. You also see this huge shift in terms of reproductive freedoms. The pill was approved in the 60s, so suddenly women had the freedom to control their own reproductive rights. And, before the pill was released, women, you just got pregnant all of the time. So people had like 5, 6 children, and anyone who has children knows that it's really, really hard to work and have 5 or 6 children. So in many ways, women, just through not being able to control their reproductive rights, were being pushed into domestic spheres and not allowed to be as engaged in society and professionally. Roe versus Wade was also a prominent piece of legislation that became law, which further empowered women to take control of their reproductive rights and decide exactly when they wanted to have children. Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 also gave women access to more equality and fairness in society and also in the professional spheres. There were all of these legislative changes that happened in the 60s, like domestic violence being outlawed and finally being addressed as something that's problematic. There was also a push to normalize work outside of the home. So all of this provides some context for what is being described in the poem. In the poem, there are references to race and also sex. So this argument that Black men needed equality and jobs more than white women is one of the tensions that existed in the early 20th century in the US as white women were fighting for equality, fighting for the right to vote, fighting for the right to work outside of the home and to have freedom and choice and say. There's always this argument of, well, Black men need to have those freedoms. And all of a sudden, once Black men were given more equality through the Civil Rights Act, white women started saying, well, if Black men have those freedoms, shouldn't we have those freedoms too? Right? So that provides a backdrop for what was happening in the feminist movement and in the civil rights movement. As a result of all of these different changes in terms of law and society, you also see the emergence of different kinds of feminism. You see radical feminism, socialist feminism, but even in those radical feminist and socialist feminist approaches, there was still a lack of representation for women of color, Black feminists. In some contexts, Black feminists and non-white feminists were just excluded from some of those steps forward that were being made in the 60s, in the early or the first half of the 20th century. And the exclusion was absolutely due to race and to class. So it's important to understand the historical context for when this poem was released for Audre Lorde's life. As the writer, the author of this poem, all of this social context absolutely had an impact and inspired some of the ideas that are being presented in this poem. Understanding the historical context sets us up for a structural analysis of the poem and to talk about the ideas in the poem. So that's the most interesting part of poetry analysis. The poem itself is about the tensions between white feminists and that privilege that white feminists have and Black women. In some ways, it's about the incompatibility of the goals of each of these different movements. The poem is separated into 3 stanzas. A stanza is like a paragraph in poetry. Notice how the first stanza and the third stanza are 3 lines. Those are called tercets, which is just a super fancy word for a 3-line stanza, right? But then the middle of the poem is much larger. It's more substantial. That lets us know that that's developed in more detail. Another element of the poem that I want to point out is the author's use of capitalization. If you notice that the first letter of each line isn't always capitalized. So the first letter of the first line is capitalized. The first letter of the first line of the second stanza is capitalized. And then in that second stanza, there are 2 other places where the lines are capitalized. They begin with capital words, right? Which gives us the idea that those are the beginnings of new thoughts. There are also some periods used throughout the poem, but for a poem that has this many lines, you might perhaps assume that there'd be more periods used, but the periods are used very judiciously, which means they're not used very frequently. The periods are used to indicate the end of almost like a sentence, even though each line could be considered a poetic sentence in and of itself. This is a free verse poem, and the lines themselves can be grouped And you can tell when a sentence ends or when a thought group of these lines ends by where there's a period and a new capitalization. That tells me, just looking at capitalization and where periods are used, that that second stanza and the third stanza go together. In that first stanza, there's a powerful metaphor about anger and tree roots. I'm going to read the lines. There are so many roots to the tree of anger that sometimes the branches shatter before they bear. Okay? So right there, this analogy of anger being a tree or something that grows, something that's alive, and a tree has many roots that anchor it into the ground. So the roots of the tree of anger, it's kind of a play on words because a root is part of the tree, but a root is also a cause of something, like the root cause of some ill effect, for example. So the root here can be interpreted as maybe things that are causing anger, right? So there are so many things that motivate people to feel angry. And when the poet writes that sometimes the branches shatter before they bear, so the roots underneath the tree, the causes of that anger, can then cause the tree itself to self-destruct. This idea of shattering. And, everyone knows that a tree itself doesn't shatter. A tree can bend, a tree can break, but a tree doesn't shatter. Something that is more fragile shatters, like glass. Something that's hard, something that is solid, very solid, can shatter. To shatter before the tree bears, that word bear could also be linked to the idea of giving birth. And in the way that that would apply to a tree, it would mean the fruit growing on the tree. So the tree might shatter before it bears, before it's able to produce something, right? And so that could be connected to the idea of anger shattering a person on the inside and breaking them before they're able to produce their greatest works. And then we have a period at the end of those first three lines, which are a tercet, and we have a new stanza where a situation is described. Sitting in netics, the women rally before they march, discussing the problematic girls they hire to make them free. So right there, notice how women is not defined. There isn't an adjective describing the women as white women, the women as any particular group. They're just described as women, right? And then you have the term girls, the problematic girls. This is a historical reference to the way that Black women were described in the 19th century and the 20th century. The idea was that white women were women and anyone else might be called a girl, right? So the problematic girls they hire might be maids, nannies, women who are domestic help. And here, the problematic girls, just based on context clues, you get the idea that the women are white women and the problematic girls are Black women. Now, if you imagine that you're sitting in and that you're listening to these women's conversations, I would argue that they're probably not using the term problematic girls. That's kind of a more polite stand-in for the words that they may actually be using. Sitting in netics, the women rally before they march, discussing the problematic girls they hire to make them free. So netics is a restaurant chain back east. And these women are rallying before they march. Just that line right there, rally before they march. March and rally are related terms. They often appear together because they're both related to the idea of protesting. So these women are rallying before they march, that is, before they go out and they protest, discussing the problematic girls they hire to make them free. So that rallying is related to their conversations about the problematic girls. And the problematic girls in this instance are the Black women or women of color who they've hired to be able to take away some of that domestic burden that they have, to then pursue their own interests, to pursue their own goals of self-actualization. Another thing that I want to point out about these lines in the poem is this idea of enjambment. Enjambment means that a line has intentionally been ended before the thought is complete and the thought is picked up on the following line. So notice how this is a complete sentence that has been separated into 4 lines. Sitting in netics, the women rally before they march, discussing the problematic girls they hire to make them free. An almost white counterman passes a waiting brother to serve them first, and the ladies neither notice nor reject the slight pleasures of their slavery. An almost white counterman passes. Notice that almost white. Again, the counterman isn't described as a Black person, a light-skinned Black person. They're described as almost white, meaning that they're almost equal, perhaps, to these women, right? So the emphasis is on the whiteness of the counterman. That brings in an aspect of colorism, even though colorism isn't described anywhere else in this poem. This kind of hierarchy of Black people who are almost white versus Black people who are deeper toned, more chocolate, and the relationship that different toned Black people have to whiteness could come into play as well. An almost white counterman passes a waiting brother. So there, a waiting brother. Brother is a euphemistic term of endearment. Black people call each other brother or sister. Even though Black people, we may not be related to someone, we still often will say, hey brother, hey sister, as a way of saying hello. It's just a term of endearment, right? It's a friendly term. So a waiting brother is served. So there's this almost white counterman and someone who the poet has chosen to describe as a brother, right? So this counterman, there's no indication of whether this counterman sees him as a brother or not, but the poet, the author, is describing him in that endearing way. And the ladies neither notice nor reject the slight pleasures of their slavery. So the ladies aren't noticing that someone has been passed up so that the counterman can wait on them rather than the gentleman who, based on context clues, is probably here first. And the ladies neither notice nor reject the slight pleasures of their slavery. So it's just become very second nature to them to be shown preference. They don't notice it, meaning it doesn't come to their attention. They don't reject it by actively pointing out that the other gentleman there, the brother, has some priority over them because he presumably got there sooner. And this idea of they're not rejecting the slight pleasures of their slavery. Oh gosh. So when I read that, I think of this just degrees. So slight means ever so small, the pleasures of their slavery, meaning they are slaves just like the countermen, just like the brother who's waiting, but they're more preferred slaves because they have more proximity, more preference with white men who in this context are never named, but white men are in many ways the focus of this poem and the privileges that white men have, right? But I, who am bound by my mirror as well as my bed, see causes in color as well as sex. But I, so the poet is referencing herself, presumably Audre Lorde, who is a Black woman. But I, who am bound by my mirror, meaning what I can see in the reflection, to see a woman in the reflection, to see a Black woman, as well as my bed, And that's a reference to gender, perhaps. Audre Lorde is a lesbian, so it could also be a reference to her sexual orientation, right? See causes in color as well as sex. Right there, there's a reference to the poet seeing the slight pleasure of the women, that is, the women's somewhat more preferred status, and the men's possibly somewhat more preferred status, because you notice the black men are sitting at the counter with the white women. So they're not exactly equal, but they're sitting, they're both able to sit there, right? I, who am bound by my mirror as well as my bed, see causes in color as well as sex. So to see a cause, to see that movement for equality, that's a reference to being able to identify with the women's liberation movement and with the Black liberation movement, right? But recognizing that there's a separation between the goals and the aims, the treatments of these two groups. And sit here wondering which me will survive all of these liberations. Now that last tercet, those last 3 lines, you can see they're a continuation of the ideas in the stanza before. And sit here wondering which me will survive all these liberations. So she's pondering, thinking about which of her identities is going to be able to survive the liberation. Is it going to be the female identity, the identity as a Black person? Which of these will survive because of that conflict that's here inherently described in the poem in juxtaposing, that means to put side by side, white women and Black men sitting at a counter. One of, just initially, a thought that I had when I read this poem was about a very well-known work in poetry about, it's an anthology of Black feminist writing. It's called All the Women Are White, All the Blacks Are Men, But Some of Us Are Brave. It is a landmark feminist anthology about Black women's studies that came out in 1982. So that was right at the tail end of that wave of feminism, that second wave of feminism. Audre Lorde writing about this tension between white feminist goals and the goals of Black male liberation is really, it's before her time. She's writing about an idea that didn't really come up until, or wasn't addressed in mainstream American society until the third wave of feminism, which started in the 1980s. She's writing about it because of the intersection between so many of her identities, that of a woman, of a Black person, of a queer person. All of these identities and the intersection of those identities and the lack of representation in the variety of communities that she shared an identity with but didn't have mainstream representation in. She's describing this in the poem. And that last line, I'm wondering which me will survive. It's this idea that, in the 1970s when this was published, it wasn't acceptable to be openly gay in the US. It wasn't acceptable or it wasn't embraced for Black women to seek the same social status as white women, or for Black women to challenge the status of Black men or white women in order to gain some social standing and equality. Now, I'm not talking about the laws, because by law, in the 1970s, Black women were by law equal to everyone else. But in practice, Black women were not equal. So that's called de facto versus de jure. De facto means that the practices, the social practices, were not those of equality, whereas de jure means the legal practices. And as I mentioned before, the laws had changed in the 60s to give women, to give Black people equality by law, but the practice was one of still continued marginalization. And there's that double layer of marginalization as a gay woman, because it wasn't in the US until, gosh, in some places, perhaps someone would argue even today, there's some places where it is very hard to be gay. But it wasn't until the late 90s, early 2000s, the beginning of this new millennium, that gay identity or just openly being gay was more acceptable in the United States. So those are the connections between the poem and the world at large. And now I'm going to get a little bit more vulnerable and talk about the connection between the poem and me and my own experience. Now, I'm not a queer woman, but I am a Black woman. And my connection to reading that poem is one, I have complex feelings about this poem. Now, if I assume that the poet, that Audre Lorde's intention was really to highlight the conflict between the intersection of male privilege and white privilege, the privilege of white women, then I think that this poem represents in many ways my own experiences that I have living in the United States as a Black woman. For me, a connection that I make is with a conversation I had with one of my colleagues at work. I was having a conversation with a white woman who I like quite a bit. She's an amazing person. She's been a very great ally for the ESL students on campus, for people of color. She and I were having a conversation, and she mentioned something about if she makes a mistake, that she never acknowledges it and apologizes for it because it's a sign of weakness. The conversation I had with her has stuck with me for years. I had this conversation with her about 5 years ago, and it stuck with me because of the level of privilege that she has in never having to apologize when she makes a mistake. Now, there is an aspect of classroom management in that, people were social creatures, but we're also hierarchical creatures. You're delusional if you think that people are not always building and creating and reconstructing social hierarchies, okay? So as a teacher, to acknowledge a mistake, people acknowledging a mistake in a classroom are penalized more. If you are a woman, if you're a woman of color, students are going to smell blood, and then it's just like, rah, 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 right? It can be quite brutal for people to see weakness in that way. But it's also, I ask myself, is not our goal as humans to develop and to grow to a place of strength through vulnerability? That is just a fundamental question that I think about and that I ask myself often. Now, if that vulnerability is perceived as weakness, as a reason to be attacked and to have a lower social status, that's problematic. But maybe it comes back to morals, I don't know. But that has stuck with me, what my colleague said to me. And I think about this idea of the women at the bar sitting and not recognizing that they have more privilege, that they're being treated in a more preferential way. Because if I make a mistake, there's an assumption that I am going to acknowledge that mistake and apologize. And perhaps my experience as a Black woman has socialized me to expect that and to also to act in that way. But that is not an experience that my white female colleague has had, because clearly she said she doesn't apologize about things. Interesting, right? Another reading of the poem could be in terms of the gendered identity in the poem, that is like this reference to queer identity. And there are some poets, some teachers who interpret the poem as being representative of identity and also kind of queer activist identity. I do see aspects of that. It's subtle. It's definitely very subtle, because even in the 70s, even in the 80s or the early 90s, I think that a mainstream poet, it would be harder for them to explicitly, that means very directly, write about a queer identity. But there are aspects of that there. And in her writing about that queer identity, I start thinking about what it would be like to be alive in the 60s and the 70s and to be a non-white person who's also queer, or even to be a white person who's queer. A white person who identifies as a gay or a lesbian or some other gender identity, that there's so much constraint on that identity. I think of another poem that Audre Lorde wrote called A Litany for Survival, where she talks about loving in doorways between dawns, coming and going, and the sheer effort that went into queer people living and enjoying their lives at a time when everything could be a danger, could be a threat, and where just their choices are questioned. So I make that connection myself, and since I'm not queer, I don't have any personal connections to make related to that, other than things that I've seen, friends that I have who are queer, and I live in the San Francisco Bay Area. So I do think that if you're going to be gay in the US, the Bay Area is a good place to be gay. It's more accepted, right? It's more accepted even in the Black community to be gay in the Bay Area than it is in a place like, I don't know, the Midwest, or even like the interior of California. Inland in California, it's not as accepted. So people finding their community can be a powerful way of feeling represented. And hopefully, I pray that Audre Lorde was able to find her community, to find people who could support her and who embraced and celebrated her identities. Even if you have no personal connection to the identities of the poet, that is, maybe you're not Black, you're not a woman, you're not queer, maybe you're not even a white woman, or you could be any of those identities. Clearly, this poem sparks something in us all, and I would love to read in the comment section about some of the connections that you make or personal reflections that you make about how this poem has impacted you or your reaction to the poem. Thank you for watching this video to the end. Check out my other videos on the channel where I have other content related to analyzing poems, ESL, advanced ESL learners. And if you have a specific video idea that you'd like to see, drop it in the comment section, okay? Take care, and I'll see you very soon.